Hey, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Jeff Hahn. Jeff, crisis management expert. Welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast.
Great to be with you, Andrea. Thank you so much.
So, we were just discussing right before I pressed record that you have done a lot of interviews in the last year. And so I asked you, what question do you wish that people would ask that haven't been asked? And you came up with a different one. You said the one that surprised you. So tell us what the surprise was.
Yeah, the first time it got asked to me, it was a surprise. And then what's been a surprise as well is that it somehow or another keeps coming up and getting asked. So that question is, what's your favorite crisis? And I've had to think, had to think, why would anybody have a favorite crisis? That's sort of that's an odd person, but
Choose your
you know,
pain.
right. For those people who do practice the craft of crisis communication, there is sort of a fascinating attraction to the space because you have this sense that um, every dark situation can be transformed into something that's light.
Mm.
And that transformative alchemy, I think it's probably in the DNA of a lot of crisis communication practitioners.
Mm.
The answer to the question, though, isn't one that looks backwards. It always looks forward because that attraction is an addiction as well.
So
So
you're
my response is my favorite crisis is the next one.
That's so great. I mean, it's great because I can relate, not necessarily to the well, kind of crisis management. I guess, I've thought about this in the past. I've noticed for myself that when something big happens, I guess you'd call it a crisis. When there's a crisis that happens, somebody gets into a car accident, or we're trying to like all of a sudden something has shifted.
Yeah, the game show Jeopardy chooses the wrong host.
Right? We just saw that today. That came out.
Crisis, reputation crisis.
When for me, when I know that I get into a zone, like I go directly into a very narrow focus. I know exactly what I need to do. I know who I need to talk to. I need who I need to help. I know, like I feel, and it feels like I don't know. There's something. It's like you're in another state of being. Yeah. This we just put our for those who can't see us on our video, we just put our hands really close to our eyes. Okay, so is this kind of the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a really interesting aspect of those who practice this craft is that they have the ability to filter out noise and focus very narrowly on moving and navigating a client from what feels very chaotic to very clear position. And that's one of the real tricks inside of the whole craft of crisis communication. It is understanding that, especially if you're managing clients, they're not used to, they don't have the equipment mentally to put those blinders on almost to filter out all that noise.
Mm, interesting.
It's a
Do you
practice, it's a learned skill.
have you taken the Strengths Finder
I have,
assessment?
yes.
And is
Yeah.
strategic really up high for you?
It is. It's a big one for me. And the other personality profile that I really love is the DISC.
Yeah, yeah.
And so my DISC profile is very high D, very high C,
Hmm.
and almost no I. That's the one about relating to people. I stands for influence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really much more about affiliation and your interest in other people. Well, I don't like people, so that's cool. This works out really well for me. And the S, when it's very low, means you have the ability to. It stands for steadiness. You have the ability to really change on the fly. And a high S means you're a very status quo. You don't like change. I almost have no S. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm a shoot from the hip guy.
S
When
is my lowest one
especially,
too. Yeah.
yeah, especially when it comes to fast moving situations where you've got to adapt quickly.
Hmm. So interesting. Okay, so could you share with us a little bit about your background? Like, what do you do? Why are we talking about this topic today?
Yeah, really, my core expertise is crisis communication. I own a communications marketing firm, and our two client specialties are food and energy. They have a relationship. I like to think of them as existing at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy.
Hmm.
They are what people need, not what people may want. There's no self actualization there. It's all about basic needs. And so we've geared our firm to focus on that space. Um, and crisis becomes an integral component to both of those, both in short span durations, like let's say a food recall, or long span, which is we would shift kind of from crisis to issues management. And in issues management, we can just take the current um, molecules to minerals transition, fossil fuels to electrification transition, the climate change imperative. This is a 20, 30-year issues management exercise, but it's being done with as much pressure as a, a 2-day crisis conversation.
Mm. And the pressure, I assume that's from the fact that it's just a big deal to start dealing with now.
Oh, for sure. There's no question that human generated carbon is overwhelming the atmosphere, and there's only one atmosphere. It doesn't matter where the carbon's coming from. We've only got one, and it's a very efficient conveyor belt all around the earth. And so that science is settled. Now the question is, how do clients who may be in fossil fuel industry adapt to that low carbon future?
Hmm.
What are the things that they're going to do to innovate? The thing that fossil fuel companies have on their side is they've got 5, 6, 7 decades of money. So they're the ones who are going to innovate the fastest and help us move to a low carbon future. I
Do you
think
think
we
they're
need to.
prepared to do that? Do they want to do
Ah,
that?
yeah. Very much like a crisis situation. You've got one day to turn something bad around to make it good. Some are well equipped and they're visionary and they've been moving in this direction. They're also making the investments they need to,
Hmm.
but a lot aren't. They're
Hmm.
dug in, and all contrast two that have been in the news this past year in a significant way. BP has made a major shift into renewables and into that low carbon future.
Hmm.
Exxon, however, was just in the news because one of their lobbyists was caught on video talking about all of the underhanded ways they've been trying to sabotage legislation in the US at the federal level to prevent it from being passed. So you just have a tale of two major players in the same place. One's ready, one's not.
Hmm. It kind of reminds me of what you're just talking about with the disc and the S, the steadiness. Like
Yeah.
when you are really a steady person, that can be such a great quality. It can be a great quality in a company too. But the problem comes when if you're not forward thinking and you're waiting for the crisis to hit, then you're pushed out of that instead of you're making proactive movements toward it.
It's so true. I mean, it's such a smart comment because the change is the only constant.
Hmm.
And the most difficult part, I think, of the crisis communication craft is convincing clients that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Yeah.
So, shall we get prepared or shall we just allow ourselves to run into the next light pole and then figure out what to do?
It also reminds me because I do a lot with personal transformation. So, and
Ah,
people
neat.
don't want to change. People don't want to change unless they have to. Again, if there's a crisis, if something happens to them and they're all of a sudden they're experiencing pain, then relieving the pain in a way where they're going to have to change feels less intimidating, or it feels like the better option finally than staying where they're at. But that's the only that most people are not proactively changing, like you're talking about. They're not growing and changing. They're waiting until something pushes them out. And the sad part about that is that then, um, I mean, it's you're just waiting for disaster to happen before you actually can move forward.
It is so true. And, we see that same phenomena in lots of different places. Just think about the idea, or you've heard of that phrase that sometimes is used by people who've experienced a life threatening disease, or I had a big heart attack. It was the quote, wake up call. I got a
Right.
big wake up call. Why did it take that? You knew you needed to start eating healthier a long time ago and stop smoking a long time ago. Why does it take that? We're funny creatures, us humans.
So it's interesting. These global problems, we'll just stay on the topic of climate crisis. In your experience, in your where you're at right now with it, where do you think that people who are resisting that change, where do you feel like there's any opening with them, or what is the crisis that's going to have to happen in order for them to make any changes? Because we're seeing so many things happening right now with fires and, more and intense storms, and ice melting, and water levels coming up a little bit, and knowing that that's happening, why aren't people paying attention?
Yeah, lots of good examples that you just rattled off. These extreme weather events are getting stronger in intensity and in frequency. I mean, I live in Austin, Texas, and we suffered through in February Winter Storm Uri, epic proportions. I mean,
Yeah.
collapsed the electric grid in the state. So crazy, crazy. But I think the answer more abstractly is, if you are a person who doesn't like change, then what you really don't like is having it forced upon you.
Yeah.
Instead, what you would prefer is grudgingly having to make the change, but controlling it. So I offer that to clients sometimes who are recalcitrant, dug in, just can't find their way towards it, and said, wouldn't you rather be the disruptor rather than being disrupted? Wouldn't you rather make a plan and execute that according to your own timeline rather than having it jammed at you? And they come around to accepting that as preferable to a sudden collision into a light pole kind of thing.
That's good. That's really good.
And sometimes it's not necessarily about the resistance to change as it is the lack of control.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk more about that.
Well, when people lack control, we're funny in that respect. We often feel like we're being taken advantage of. That somehow or another, because we're not controlling the situation, that something's happening we can't see, and it's not to our benefit. It's a sort of it's an interesting paranoia that high control people have. That it's a flashpoint embedded deep in the subconscious that lack of control means somebody's taking advantage of me. Um, that right there can become a really important thread to pull on to bring a client into a new place where they say, yeah, I don't like change. What I like less is not being able to dictate that change.
Hmm.
So all of a sudden, we're not talking about, hey, how about we make you relevant into this low carbon future or this new next wonderful place? It's about uh, um, you're kind of working in the negative space, right? We have to change. And if you want to control it, great. If you don't, then you're going to get pulled along and you're not going to like it.
I think that that makes so much sense, and it brings it to that personal level. It taps into what somebody wants, not what somebody doesn't want. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
without just like forcing it, like you're talking about.
I think that's an important distinction that you make. If I want control, I don't like change. So it's wants versus likes. And the way you laid it out there helps illuminate that point.
Hmm. So, could you set the stage for us for what led you to write your book, Breaking Bad News? Because it took a long time to write, right?
Took me 7 years to write Breaking Bad News. Well, I'll, yeah, I had a frustration, and this may be true for many authors. They're looking at the world and just saying, I don't think it ought to be like that. In my case, I have been doing crisis communication for more than 30 years. And I've run across people who, because they're much better looking than me, they have much better hair, somehow or another, they've got this confidence that they walk in the room as suits and they know what they're doing. And people listen to them. They've got this sort of dark art orientation. Like, yeah, let me just sit here and tell you at the right moment in time something different than what you've been saying. I've always been frustrated by that character because I've been in dozens of war rooms over the years. It got me to thinking that, you know what, this is crap, to put it bluntly. Um, Crisis communication is not a dark art. You don't need a Harry Potter wand or a really fancy suit. What it is instead is a system. And once I landed on that idea, I said, yeah, it's a system. And inside this system, if you take it step by step, using the proper tools at the right time, you can navigate any difficult situation. And that's how Breaking Bad News was formed. It was a desire to demystify crisis communication as some sort of a crazy dark art and then define, okay, what are those steps? What am I going to move through? What are the key decisions I need to make? And then here's the X factor. How fast do I need to make them? My answer to that X factor question, you got about 2 hours today. These days, you got about 2 hours to control the narrative, protect your reputation, protect your brand. Yeah, 120 minutes. Go.
Wow. Okay, so many questions. So, first of all, people need a plan. People are more willing to move forward if there's a path. And so it makes a lot of sense that it would be very helpful to to companies, to organizations, especially people who are in charge of those organizations, to know what their plan will be. And so tell us a little bit about how you recommend people start thinking about this. Since if they only have 2 hours once it starts, you can't be
Yeah.
reading the book then.
No, it's a very good book to read, but it's not that good. And in fact, the way that I would reframe it is um, a plan doesn't tell you what to do, it tells you how to manage through whatever the situation is.
Yeah.
Because you can't plan for every situation and all the nuances and dynamics. But if you had a method, then you could start down the path of solving for whatever is thrown at you. And so in Breaking Bad News, what I do is, first of all, acknowledge um, people don't do this every day. They're not good at it. If you don't do it every day or have a high degree of practice with it, every time it's brand new. For your rapid response team, the only plan you really need is something that you can write on the size of a credit card or a business card. And that plan, all it has on it is how to get in touch once the red bat phone lights up. How do you connect? What conference room do you go to? What Zoom channel do you get on? Or what conference phone number do you call into? That's the plan. Now, once you are gathered, who's going to be the decision maker and who's going to be the person who is the subject matter expert, who's going to be the attorney, who's going to be the communications person, all of that has to be programmed into one piece of paper. Get those things down, and now the team can work through the tools. Here's the methodology. In that 2 hours that I'm giving you in my model, you have 5 things to do. The first thing to do is assemble. If you can pull out that little credit card and get together, you've actually done something that 90% of the clients that I work with can't do very easily.
I bet.
It's
I
just,
I can I can imagine how chaotic it would be. And then all of a sudden you're trying to say, "Oh wait, we need to get together and who are we getting together?" And it makes so much sense to already have that in place.
yeah, that's the only thing that you really need to have pre-programmed. Next, you need to execute a series of decisions. And there's four great big ones left in my model. The first is if any situation is unfolding rapidly and publicly, that's really key, is a crisis isn't a crisis until it's public. And public can mean internal to an organization, but multiple people know.
Mhm.
And you really can't control their interpretation. So they own it. And they own it because they also own your reputation. You don't own your own reputation, it's owned by others. And now they are processing what they see happening up against what they know about your reputation. They're asking themselves, what's going to happen here? They're ready to receive information. That's good. So this is a public event. And the first thing you need to do is establish the fact that you're on the scene. It's called a holding statement. Holding statements are 100 words or less, and they simply say, we're showing up here. We know something is happening. We don't like it. It's not something that we're going to enjoy, but we're not going to shirk away from it.
And you're sharing that holding statement with people outside the room?
All of your stakeholders,
Okay.
anyone who needs to hear it.
Mhm.
You're basically saying there is a situation, we see it just like you see it, and we're here to start managing it. You're not trying to solve anything. You're not even trying to deliver any empathy in the moment,
Mhm.
unless it's obviously calls for it.
Mhm.
But holding statements first. Then the team works for the three M's. Message. What's your message going to be? Messenger. Who's going to deliver it? And then finally, method of delivery. Now, here's the biggest mistake that rapid response teams make. The assumption is let's get the CEO in front of a press conference.
Why is that a bad idea?
Two worst ideas ever developed. First of all, the CEO may not be the right messenger. He or she may not have the subject matter expertise to match the moment. So
Mm.
that's a bad assumption. The second is the press conference is the most uncontrolled environment that you could possibly put someone in. Who here and anybody listening can say they've ever been, they have great practice doing press conferences? Unless you work in the White House, the answer is very, very few of us. That is a super unique environment. There's a combination of demolition derby and on ice. So, okay, get the CEO. We're going to put him in front of a press conference. So that's just, that's just dumb.
Hmm.
But the reason it's not unusual, it's because people haven't considered their options. In messages, you have 16 options, especially when there's blame to be spread. In Messenger, you have 9 options. In your method of delivery, press conference is only one of a dozen options. And so knowing the tools and knowing that you have options allows the team now to, now that we're gathered, all right, for our message, here's our option number 13. That's what we're going to use. Our messenger option 3. That's who delivering it. And for method, option 6. Boom, boom, boom. On my menu, I've just walked through the options, walked my rapid response team through their choices. None are right, none are wrong. There's preference in all of these, but you've got a game plan and you can do it
Mhm.
in under 2 hours.
Mhm. Oh, that's good. Especially when everything feels chaotic, it's so nice to have clarity. So to have the options in front of you and all you have to do is look at the options. That brings that focus for everybody who's having a hard time focusing. It helps them to focus.
You got it. We've been sharing the blinders with our hands over our eyes, look back and forth here. But yeah, all of a sudden your field of vision narrows from this chaos that's happening in the periphery, very clear.
Yeah.
And that's such a huge help. Um, because what's happening inside of our heads is a phenomena called dissonance. That's the other factor that we often don't give enough credit to. But when something happens that's terribly dissonant, it means that what you believe isn't matched by what's real.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned the game show Jeopardy earlier. What does Jeopardy believe? It believes that it's got a loyal fan base that, but the host is a really extraordinary person. They selected a host, a really extraordinary person. That's what they believed yesterday. Today, not so much, not extraordinary. That feeling, that like just sort of the snapped rubber band onto your hand is called dissonance. And you can only do one thing: solve it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the propulsion system, by the way, of any good crisis work. It's resolving dissonance.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, the dissonance or the problem, the pain, solving that and
Yeah.
making it better is, and it usually does. It propels, I'm sure, the crisis thing, but it also propels any person, any organization toward growth.
Oh, for sure. I've been sort of a skeptic in my career on whether or not crises are a good thing, if
Hmm.
they create opportunity. And I gotta tell you, they're so emotionally draining and difficult for people that I've always been a little bit skeptical, but I've come around to your point of view. Um, and I've come to learn that if you can manage well, and typically that requires you to have some core values that are shared, um, then you do come out a little stronger. You sure do learn a lot,
You do.
and in one of those big learnings is I don't want that to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps a little practice with the team every once in a while is a good
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I've always, I mean, I guess I've kind of looked at pain as though it's not the pain itself, but the opportunity to resolve pain. I guess that propulsion thing that you're talking about, that is one of the biggest um, unused resources that we have. And
Yeah.
if people can utilize that as a resource, that they can understand how it could propel them forward, that they'd be better equipped to be able to move forward.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you'll hear that expressed in some pithy terms. Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago, said, never waste a good crisis, or don't let a good crisis go to waste. And he's talking about that opportunity that you're discussing, which is um, you can, in fact, be a better brand. One of the great case studies of crisis lore is Tylenol, Johnson and Johnson. Is it a better company? Is it a better, safer brand as a result of what happened so many decades ago? It is.
Could you remind us of that? I know what you're talking about, but maybe somebody in the audience doesn't.
Yeah, just very broad brush terms. Someone sabotaged a lot of Tylenol bottles, and those were capsules back then. Those capsules got taken apart, and the medicine inside of them for pain relief got substituted for cyanide. So a handful of people were killed by taking Tylenol tablets or Tylenol capsules that had been tampered with. Now, today, we look back on that and say tamper-proof bottles, seals, all of these, double wraps. That's made Johnson and Johnson a safer brand, and that's good. That's good. Now, the interesting part about that particular case is if you were to apply what Johnson Johnson did back then today, they would have gone bankrupt.
Mm.
They were so slow in responding to that situation. In today's accelerated time fashion, they would have been crushed in the news cycle. In fact, I was just going to add a fine point to it. It took them 7 days to finally create their own recall. CVS and Walgreens pulled Tylenol off the shelf 2 days before Johnson and Johnson did. I mean,
Okay.
today you're dead meat if you do that.
Yep. Yep. Let's keep talking about timeline. Because that's something that you discuss. So we're not talking about just that first 2 hours. The first 2 hours is critical, but then obviously there's more of a timeline. What else would you like to share with us about the timeline that you see for crisis situations?
It's a 2 hour time window for one specific purpose. That's to control the narrative so that media and especially social media don't get out of control. Misinformation doesn't take center stage and trolls don't get the upper hand. So, crisis communication, once it's extended out over a long duration, that's when the whole ball game metamorphosizes. That's when the whole ball game evolves from crisis communication to crisis management. And now, when you're in crisis management, you're really looking at the reputation long term. And you have the opportunity then, just like what we were talking about earlier, now you can look and reflect on, all right, how do we make sure that we, for one, take corrective action now that prevents future situations? And this present to future teeter totter is super helpful because over the next several days, you can extend it just a little bit longer. But what you want to be able to do within 5 days is articulate not only the corrective action that you've taken, but how you're going to prevent it in the future. So you've got a little bit of time, but controlling that narrative up front so that you get the breathing room that you need to make those decisions is the most challenging part of the whole apparatus.
Yeah, that makes sense because I think a lot of times people want to go straight to, well, why did this happen, and how am I going to fix this so it doesn't ever happen again, and that sort of thing. And you're saying, hey, hold on, you're going to get a chance to think about that. You got some other things to take care of first.
Yeah, exactly. I remember working with one client who felt like they just had to do a press conference against my advice, but okay. And one of the questions they got asked in the middle of a situation that was really fraught, got asked, "Are you worried about lawsuits?" Well, now that is a hypothetical that takes you into the future. So it's that kind of thing that you want to be able to say, you know what? That is a question that's not appropriate for right now. Right now, we are concerned about X. We're going to do Y and we're going to get to Z. There'll be another time for us to address that dumbass question. That's the way I feel about it.
Well, I mean, that is one of the problems with a press conference
Oh,
is
yeah.
leaving yourself open to questioning, and then if you don't take questions, people are mad. If you don't answer them the way that they want, they're mad.
In press conferences, the real art is to respond, not answer.
Mm.
And that means pivoting back to your core messages. Boy, talk about a trained skill. Those that are good at it are really awesome. Those that are bad at it, I make a living off of showing workshop groups the clips of those failed episodes.
So, bad news has obviously been a big issue in the last year or so, a couple years. How have you seen your model, or how have you processed the whole situation with COVID and how people are responding, and you know have you applied this model in that way?
It's a great question and one of the most difficult to answer because COVID, first of all, it's a paradigm shift for everyone.
Right.
We've we in our generation and everyone alive today hasn't been through it before. So it's even though plagues and pandemics have been around for millennia, we're not exactly sure how to manage that. Not only from a communication standpoint, from a healthcare standpoint. That's one. Everything's new, and um, that's the fault of human beings that we are not able to transfer wisdom over generations very effectively. The challenge of COVID-19 and communications is I've never specifically felt like there was a North Star. What is it that what problem are we trying to solve? Are we trying to defeat the the virus, Or are we trying to change public behaviors? Could we have, in fact, created a two-part communications plan uh, that stacked those two things? We're going to defeat the virus, and here's your role. We need the public to do X and Y and Z. Here's the role that big pharma, that scientific research is going to play. Here's the role that government is going to play. And the clear articulation and the assignment of roles seems to me to have been it's still a moving target. I hear from the CDC, then I see Dr. Fauci. Who's this guy? And why is the White House surgeon making, and now well, who do I listen to? So it's a failure of cohesive message, in my view, that's been such a strange thing. I don't know who to pay attention to. Then, of course, their message amongst all those characters, it's been different. And on one day, you don't need to really worry about masks in the early going. Now everybody wear a mask. Now governors around states feel like they are somehow or another the medical experts. And when you have a vacuum like this, don't be surprised when a lot of people tumble into it and allow themselves to be sucked into it. That's been sort of the chaotic dimension of this long running, highly durable crisis of the pandemic. It's been so difficult to try to grab onto one thing and just let's get that one thing settled and fixed. It's not been easy to do.
It really hasn't. And I mean, when there are so many different voices saying different things, and then it turns into not just well, is it this way or that way, but is it even true or not? And
Yeah.
what is reality is really difficult to nail down too.
Yeah. And since I don't have a source of truth, I'm going to find the one that I believe. Well, now what have we done? We've just set people against each other.
Yeah. Yeah, which is so sad. Hmm. What about for companies, or I know some hospitals now are saying you're going to have the vaccine to work here. We're getting more of this vaccine mandate kind of thing. So let's bring it to the organizational level. Um, our organization has decided we're going to do X because of the pandemic or in response to the pandemic. At that point, what is the best way to communicate that so that people aren't feeling threatened, or, I mean, not that you can totally control that, but what would you recommend for organizations to do when they're communicating that sort of information now?
Yeah, it's a really challenging one because the audience is in a different place. The audience isn't homogenized,
Yeah.
and that's really why the communication has to have multiple points of attack or multiple dimensions to it. There's a model that I really love using. Um, your listeners may have heard of Dr. Robert Cialdini.
Mm-hmm.
And Cialdini is an expert on persuasion and persuasive language. His book, Influence, The Science of Persuasion, that book, once I read it, maybe a decade ago, I threw it on the floor and said, why didn't somebody tell me? I've been lurching around in the dark all these years, and here are all the answers. So I was mad at him. Since then, I've been to 3 of his seminars. So and I've got all of his books, but I love using Cialdini's model in these kinds of cases because you've got to meet your audience where they are.
Mm.
Let's just take a single hospital. Well, it's got multiple audiences, even in the staff members, some who strongly believe in an idea, some who are very worried about an idea. And so the method that Cialdini allows us to work through is that there are 6 persuasion levers that we can pull. Reciprocation. Hey, if you get a vaccine, I'll give you $100. That's for some, that'll do the job. Liking. You know what? I'm a person who got vaccinated, and I saw it to it that my family was taken care of as well. I like that. That resonates with me. So that hits somebody. Perhaps, though, Those two don't work. So you move to the next two. Um, Authority. We tend to believe people who are in authoritative positions. So I might roll out as my messenger, my chief medical officer. Well, how about this? What if I roll out a patient who said I didn't want to get vaccinated, but just experienced a wake up call, as we were talking about earlier? They can be very powerful messengers and they can be authority figures. Well, in authority, you also are paired up with his fourth lever, which is consensus. We're all getting the vaccination. Now, in cases where mandates are being put into place, authority is certainly being used. But you have two other levers at your disposal. One of them is consistency. If you've got vaccinated when you were a kid for mumps, measles, and rubella or polio, then you'll want to continue to do that. If you get a flu shot every year, this is just like that. Consistency, it can be a very nice, it's almost like a gentle ramp into the next thing. You did a little thing, let's do another thing and another thing and another thing. It's a very effective persuasion technique. And your messaging can be oriented towards something like this. If you're a person who exercises, if you're a person who takes vitamins, and if you're a person who tries to do healthy things, even like drink water every day and stay hydrated, then getting the vaccine is just one more good thing you can do. That's the consistency principle at work. I'm moving you up a staircase of aligned behaviors. But if you're still out in the wilderness and you don't want any of this, you can use a scarcity. That's the sixth persuasion technique. Use a scarcity method. And a scarcity method sounds like this. For those of you who aren't vaccinated, you're sitting ducks. You are putting yourself in a position that you no longer have control of what might happen to you as you move about and do what you do. I don't take risks when it comes to my family's health. That's why we do everything we can to protect ourselves. You might be Mr. or Miss Vegas. You like to take a lot of risks? Have at it. So sometimes you have to be just sort of that, I don't know if that's flippant, but it's assertive and it's a little bit like, I'm not going to be like you. You put people into this scarcity mindset, like, oh, I'm putting myself on an island here. Sometimes they'll agree. But in situations that are as complex and convoluted as COVID messaging, I go back to the church of Robert Cialdini. I think about his 6 persuasion techniques and really think hard through my messaging and ask myself, which of these is going to be most effective for the segments of the audience that I have to address?
Hmm. That was very, very helpful. So Jeff, as we're kind of wrapping up, I want to ask you about, where people can find your book and that sort of thing. And then I'll have one more question for you.
Sure.
So why don't we start with that? Where can people find your book and find you?
Best place to find me is on my author's page. It's breakingbadnewsbook.com. And if anyone's interested in getting a copy of Breaking Bad News, I'll make that available to your audience, Andrea, for the cost of the postage stamp. They can fill out the information. We've got a sample set of reserve copies that we're making available. And so they're welcome to come and get a copy at no charge except for that postage stamp. Just fill out the information.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. Thank you. And my last question for you is, as for people who would like to have a voice of influence, what parting words would you like to leave with them?
I've always been a person who looked for ways to make complicated things more simple. And if I think about my own career, that's been a key to me feeling more and more and more confident along the way. So if you are a person who wants to have a voice of influence, study the idea of models that simplify complex information and help people understand the world. And you become an expert in that particular subject because you got a neat little diagram that explains weird and wacky stuff in a really simple and obvious way. Boy, that's boosted my confidence like 10 million X over the years. And it's allowed me to say to myself, I can be a person of influence, and I should be, because now I've got this little technique that anybody can learn, but that I feel sort of like it's got given me a superpower.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Love that. And if anybody needs help with that, that's part of what we do. That's fantastic. Helping people kind of nail that down. That's awesome. Thank you so much for this really fun conversation about a really difficult topic.
Well, I've enjoyed it, enjoyed being with you and thinking through some of these challenges. It's a strange universe for many, many people, and most would rather not be in it. I've got a weirdness about me that I love it. So I'm happy to talk to anyone about it.
That's
So thank you
awesome.
very much.
Thank you. Thanks for being a voice of influence for our listeners today.